Part 2. With the Yanukovych regime having fled and Ukraine liberated, the celebration was short-lived. With the collapse of Ukraine's central government and the pathetic state of Ukraine's military, Russia saw an opportunity to take direct control of the country. The annexation of Crimea. The first wave of Russia's infamous invasion of Ukraine started with the sudden appearance of little green men all over Crimea. No, not those little green men. These little green men. Russian troops without official insignias or uniforms started appearing all over Crimea. Ukrainian forces, caught off guard and not wanting to escalate the situation, handed over control of Crimea to Russian forces without conflict or violence. Since Crimea has a substantially larger Russian population than the rest of Ukraine, due to the mass deportation of Tatars and Ukrainians, pro-Russian sentiment there has always been substantially higher than in any other region, and separation from Ukraine, or full autonomy, was always a potential reality. While it is easy to place the blame on Ukrainian troops for so easily surrendering, Ukraine's military force at this time consisted of less than 6,000 troops with hopelessly outdated equipment. Theft, corruption, over-reliance on Russian protection, and economic decline resulted in a Ukrainian military more comparable to a mid-sized American police force than a European military force. We are now seeing the Russian military in a similar state of rot, just at a larger scale and with theoretically more advanced hardware. Additionally, Crimea played perpetual host to Russian military forces, and direct conflict could have resulted in incredibly violent escalation. So Crimea was lost without a shot fired after a sham referendum to join Russia was conducted under armed guard of Russian troops. I personally believe, were Putin actually the brilliant strategist his cult purports him to be, he could have leveraged soft power and propaganda and gotten Crimea to legitimately join the Russian Federation through sham elections and coercion. He could have then turned the former Ukrainian territory into a utopian beacon to lure the rest of Ukraine back under Russian influence. But then again, he could have just done that to Russia itself. With the wealth and resources of the Russian Federation, a more earnest leader could have built a true world power, envy of the rest of Europe and a model for the Slavic world. Instead, this small-minded thug has perpetuated a backwards kleptocracy where 20% of the population don't even have indoor plumbing. Anti-Maidan protests. Russian-backed protests popped up around southern and eastern regions of Ukraine. With Crimea secured, Russia wanted to build a land bridge to the peninsula while simultaneously landlocking Ukraine. Protests staged by Russian and pro-Russian groups sprouted up in these regions. However, most were immediately and overwhelmingly stamped out. Protests in 4 cities escalated to violence. Kharkiv, Odessa, Luhansk, and Donetsk all had local government buildings and squares occupied by Russian supporters. Kharkiv was host to mass protests and counter-protests, bombings, and general unrest, but never escalated to massive direct conflicts. The insurgency in Odessa resulted in approximately 50 fatalities when an occupied building was set on fire, the largest singular conflict at the time. But the protests in Luhansk and Donetsk escalated to direct military conflict. The initial uprisings were put down by Ukrainian forces, but Russia escalated the situation by sending in armed protesters who were later revealed to be Russian agents and soldiers. No longer a civil issue, the conflict was evolving into a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, even if everyone refused to label it as such. One thing that gets under my skin is that there are many regions within Ukraine that have majority Russian-speaking populations concentrated in urban centers that could have just as likely joined the protests. Sumy, Chernihiv, Poltava, even Kiev itself should have been just as susceptible to Russian-backed riots. Funny how the areas that would not build a land bridge to Crimea were never inspired by the same revolutionary spirit. War in the Donbas. While the initial protests were backed by Russia, they were still run by locals who were either brainwashed from generations of Russian propaganda, legitimately fed up with Ukrainian incompetence and corruption, wanted to join Russia, or all of the above. While pro-Russian sentiment was not insignificant, Ukrainian forces were making advances in quelling the fighting, and it seemed things would die off. Until Russia then began funneling weapons, equipment, and troops directly into the region. It is incredible that, according to Russian propaganda, the Ukrainians on Maidan were CIA-backed, and NATO-funded sleeper agents due to their super modern bicycle helmets and cutting-edge long wooden stick technology. Yet the rebels in the Donbas were just concerned local citizens fighting for their independence who just happened to have Russian gear, weapons, communications, uniforms, small arms, tanks, and passports, all led by Russians. At this point, Russia was directly sending troops into the region, famously on vacation. The centers of this area were Donetsk and Luhansk. The famous battle for the Donetsk airport and other skirmishes established Ukrainian troops as hard-fighting yet under-equipped and green. The media continued to call this a civil issue. However, at this point, it was overtly a war between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian refugee crisis. The first one. The conflict in Crimea and the Donbas created massive waves of refugees fleeing to other regions of the country and abroad. Kiev and western Ukraine took the bulk of refugees, and a significant amount of pro-Russian Ukrainians immigrated to Russia.
Bye, Felicia.
This upended the lives of millions of people. Property was abandoned, families split apart, and people fled ancestral homelands as the conflict raged. While the scale and intensity of the war in the Donbas was nowhere near the current conflict, the results were the same, as refugees were forced to start new lives, leaving everything behind. A lot of snarky internet keyboard warriors out there like to moan and whinge that, oh, why do Ukrainians get preferential treatment? No other refugees are this welcome in Europe. This war has been ongoing for the last 8 years, and a lot of these refugees are starting over with little more than a suitcase for a second time. There's not even an English language Wikipedia article on the topic. No one gave a shit the first time. Petro Poroshenko. Following the flight of Yanukovych, an interim government was hastily established. The Maidan revolution had no strong leadership and was built from a patchwork of people from all across the country with various political backgrounds. The collapse of the Ukrainian government left a vacuum that was filled with a provisional government. Poroshenko ran against a recently liberated Tymoshenko, and thankfully emerged victorious. Tymoshenko, rightfully seen as the corrupt old guard of politics, was freed from prison with much fanfare, but was not embraced as a leader. Poroshenko, a billionaire who made a fortune with his confectionery empire, was elected as new head of a fiercely independent Ukraine, who was decidedly pro-EU. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down by a Russian Buk anti-air system in a tragic loss of civilian life. Initial reports amongst Russian troops and media touted the plane as a Ukrainian military aircraft. Once it was obvious the aircraft was civilian, Russians were forced to backpedal and crank propaganda to 11, claiming Ukrainians shot it down. An international investigation, led by the Dutch, found conclusively that Russia directly supplied the Buk system and smuggled it back into Russia after the error was uncovered. Russia still has not faced consequences for this criminal act. The Minsk Agreements. Naturally, the conflict was to be mediated by the totally impartial Belarusian president and Putin lapdog, Lukashenko. This would be something akin to your abusive alcoholic father's stripper girlfriend being the judge in your custody hearing. The first Minsk Protocol established a shaky ceasefire along with regulations and limitations of the conflict. These were violated by Russian-backed troops, and the agreement was a bit of a wash. The second Minsk Agreement seemed to take hold with minimal violations on both sides, with the major exception of Russian troops continuing offenses in the Battle of the Debaltseve, forcing Ukrainian troops to withdraw. The conflict then seemed to enter a stalemate, another one of Russia's frozen conflicts that could be leveraged politically when needed and ensure incredible instability in the countries over which Russia exerts their power. With the ceasefire, the hot conflict cooled, and Ukraine settled into an uneasy peace. But while the direct military engagement phase of Russia's operation was stalled, a misinformation campaign on a shocking scale was about to begin. Russian PsyOps and propaganda. Before delving into the muck of Russia's strategy and methodology around propaganda, there are two very important propaganda tactics that you should be aware of, as they are at the very heart of Russia's disinformation campaign: whataboutism and Russophobia. To understand the defense of Russian propaganda and how copious and obvious lies are simply disregarded, you have to understand whataboutism. This is the most popular deflection mechanism for Russian shills, bots, hacks, and apologists, and has been since the Soviet Union. Any criticism of the Kremlin, point of conflict, or debate is immediately refuted with, well, what about, and insert topic. This tactic has largely been co-opted by trolls, talking heads, and politicians around the world to avoid discussion of the actual issues and simply muddy the waters. Any debate where one side is unable to maintain focus on a singular issue and continuously brings up parallel but totally unrelated issues is a bad faith argument made by people ill-equipped to defend the indefensible. Let's take this onion-esque example from American think tank, the Cato Institute. Vladimir Putin's government bears responsibility for the terrible crime of invading Ukraine. Whatabouts, too? American arrogance, ignorance, and recklessness contributed to today's crisis. So the topic of Russians killing Ukrainians has become America bad. You will almost certainly not see an example of whataboutism this obvious and painfully unaware, unless it's dripping in irony. But you will see it on message boards, comment sections, political debates, and it is a beloved tool of the Kremlin to simply obfuscate the issues and deny responsibility, while shifting blame or focus to a different topic or party altogether. For situations they can't whatabout themselves out of, they simply dismiss the point being made as anti-Russian. Ignoring all context or validity, they easily brush off any claims using this, denouncing the point as innately antagonistic to Russia and not worth even addressing. Keep an eye out for both of these, because you will see them in play everywhere. The Russian propaganda strategy in Ukraine was the same as with any other country it deems unfriendly. Its main goals are destabilization, fostering existing internal conflict, creating doubt and uncertainty, weakening existing and potential alliances, all while pushing a victimization narrative. However, the early days of Russia's vilification of Ukraine had some nuances to overcome. While governmental relationships between Russia and Ukraine were always quite toxic, on an individual level, there was a tremendous amount of intermingling between the two nations. Most Russians have family or friends in Ukraine, and the inverse is also true, with many Ukrainians having connections to Russia. It's not a faraway land of make-believe, and the Kremlin wanted to construct an image of a united Slavic front battling the evil West. With the Maidan revolution, this brotherly approach to Ukrainian relations did an about-face as they began rapidly inventing subversive propaganda against Ukraine at an alarming rate. The propaganda coming out of Russia in the early days of the war often contradicted itself. Zionist puppeteers controlling the Ukrainian government, and the infiltration of Ukrainian government by neo-Nazis. Ukrainian language is just a dialect of Russian, and Russian speakers in Ukraine being suppressed and hunted. As anyone without lasting brain trauma can tell you, these are diametrically opposing viewpoints, as they can't both be simultaneously true. But that is just how Russian propaganda works. Blatant, horrific, and senseless lies forced into the public from an open fire hose of noise. A never-ending deluge of misinformation, misdirection, and subversion used to drown their own populace, who, through an intentionally gutted education system focusing on rote memorization and obedience, have long since lost the ability for critical thought. Russia used these early days of the conflict to perfect their PsyOps playbook before unleashing it on the world. Before the term fake news ever came to prominence, Russian speakers the world over were being bombarded with lies about Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government. Russian propaganda in action. We all have friends or family who have been hopelessly brainwashed by consuming a media diet of nothing but Rupert Murdoch-owned news outlets, then talk radio, and eventually exclusively posts on Facebook or internet message boards, slowly turning them into an ultra-paranoid QAnon-supporting zombie. This is quite unfortunate. However, for someone to fall prey to this level of brainwashing in America, they have to create a cocoon of their own mental demise, an echo chamber where they intentionally cut themselves off from anything other than the media that directly feeds into their own confirmation bias. In Russia, this propaganda is unavoidable. It is impossible for someone who has not experienced the degree of control the Russian state has over their media to truly understand how tight the grip on information is. This control creeps into every aspect of life. I have many friends in Russia who I would qualify as intelligent, compassionate, and worldly, who still struggled with the understanding that the vast majority of what comes out of the Russian government is an outright lie. I was in St. Petersburg at the time of the 70th anniversary of the Soviet victory over the Nazis and constantly encountered the hate that the Russian media had created. Anti-American and anti-Ukrainian bumper stickers, banners, and graffiti were quite literally everywhere. All the while, Russians celebrated one of humanity's darkest times with the tact and sensitivity of a hockey championship victory. The Besmertny Polk shouted slogans while holding placards of relatives who died in the Great Patriotic War. And calling it that is in and of itself revisionist history, since the Soviets and then later Russians only consider the war to have started in 1941. This is so they can conveniently avoid the fact that the Soviets allied with Hitler to share in the dismantling of Poland. War monuments draped in flowers and gaudy banners, children wearing military fatigues playfully marching in formation, army parades, and the gaudy and authoritarian celebration of military hardware were a bit unsettling. I have to say that there were some incredible moments in Russia, and having friends in the country who open their hearts and homes to you in hospitality is a beautiful thing. I, for one, am still holding out hope that Russians will listen to their better angels and revolt against the horrors being committed in their name. But there is an ever-present undercurrent of governmental control humming in the background that Russians exist in, from the cradle to the grave, that is quite hard for a Western audience to comprehend. Russian influence abroad. Russian propaganda has been steadily seeping into online discourse and political conversations more and more in recent years. A prime example of this influence, that can be directly linked to the war in Ukraine, would be the 2016 U.S. election. During the election, several figures with unsettling connections to Russia joined Trump's campaign. Unabashed Putin apologist and Batman villain Roger Stone, Putin ally and convicted felon, foreign agent General Michael Flynn, and political advisor to the corrupt and ousted Ukrainian President Yanukovych, Paul Manafort, with Manafort being a player in igniting the Maidan revolution. With the addition of these decidedly un-American Americans to Trump's political campaign, combined with Trump's suspicious history of receiving Russian money and spouting Kremlin talking points, a pro-Russian ideology began inserting itself into the Republican Party. Over time, Trump reversed key Republican platform points in relation to Ukraine. Stop the push for arming Ukraine, reverse Russian sanctions put in place after the annexation of Crimea, undermine the Magnitsky Act, reduce financial aid to Ukraine, and weaken NATO. Compounded with Russians meeting within Trump Tower offering Russian intel, and Trump himself publicly requesting the Russian government launch cyber attacks against the United States.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Fostered a decidedly pro-Russian Republican bid for the presidency. Russian tactics and online propaganda and a weaponized social media campaign carpet-bombed the net with anti-left and anti-democrat messaging and resulted in one of the dirtiest political races in modern history and a shocking upset as Trump won the presidency. Using the same tactics that were honed in Ukraine, Russia was able to successfully reverse decades and decades of Republican talking points and created a group of voters who viewed a murderous tyrant as someone more admirable than the current president of the United States. They also used tactics to create discord around sensitive topics in America: race, religion, gun control, gay rights, vaccination, abortion, etc. Simultaneously, a country the majority of Republicans had never thought of, Ukraine, was now vilified at worst and marginalized at best, with no concrete rationale or reason. After 50 years of Republicans being better dead than red, they were now the party of better Russian than Democrat, all in the span of just a few months. As terrifying as it is impressive. Ukraine's Great Awakening. Following the events of Maidan, Ukraine seemed to have a tremendous swell of patriotism and pride. Toppling the Russian-backed Yanukovych regime and seeing the results of systemic corruption and incompetence that had left their government and military unable to defend itself, Ukraine set off on a campaign of eliminating corruption from within the country and building its military from the ground up. With the tacit and lukewarm support of Europe and the conflict in the Donbas region at a stalemate, Ukraine was able to focus on the work of retooling the entire administrative function of the country. A massive wave of anti-corruption measures were passed across the whole of Ukraine. Programs to combat the long-standing issue of bribery and local palm greasing were addressed by moving more transactions into the digital sphere. Visa renewals for foreign residents had to follow stricter rules, taxes need to be paid, and fees and fines were digitally tracked and recorded. A more systemic approach to anti-corruption was the restructuring of the entire police force in Ukraine. The old corrupt Soviet-style militia was replaced with a new Western-styled police force called Politia. Their uniforms, approach, documentation, and methodology were updated as the old guard was phased out and replaced by a new generation of Ukrainians with a new set of cultural values. The new police force was substantially less likely to extort money from the populace and treated the job as an actual vocation instead of a source of supplementary income. Ukraine fell more in line with European standards for judicial practices as prisons were reformed to be less punitive, and regulations and legal procedures were better documented. Many governmental operations were digitized with the launch of the DIA app, and opening a new business was a new hell of red tape as bribery was replaced with standard bureaucracy. More importantly, the Ukrainian military was being molded to meet NATO standards, with Western nations providing training, support, oversight, and governance in building a new military from scratch. This resulted in a Ukrainian economy that slowly recovered from the pains of near default, governmental collapse, and foreign invasion. Ukraine was seen as a sound technological, manufacturing, and agricultural investment as industries were strengthened and the economy rebounded. Ukrainians were also granted visa-free travel to the EU for their efforts. While the Poroshenko administration attempted to address the staggering number of issues that faced Ukraine following the revolution, the growth and change was relatively slow. Without obviously transformative results, a lot of Ukrainians became disillusioned with the pace at which Ukraine improved and looked at the Candyman billionaire more and more as an ineffectual member of the elite rather than a servant of the people.
Обережно, двері зачиняються.